I'm really honored to be included on this panel. I've enjoyed the... I'm sorry? Yeah. I've enjoyed the other papers tremendously. And I'm now about to offer you something completely different. I'm not, as the title of my talk suggests, I'm not actually speaking about protest as it's unfolded in Russia. There are plenty of things that could be said on that topic. But I'm actually going to be focusing in this presentation on the acts of the Russian state. My interest via my recent research has been in tracing the complex after effects and the aftermath of international democracy promotion in the post-socialist context in Russia specifically. The 1990s was an era of neoliberal democratization in Russia following socialism's demise, a demise that was experienced as catastrophic by many subjects. And my earlier work was looking at the instabilities of form involved in this project. So this latest project, which focuses on state-run youth organizations, so a youth theme here in common with some of the other panelists, has been examining the state-run project to capture and captivate the energies of youth. My research began as stabled by petrodollars. The Russian state and the Putin administration began to undertake a bold nationalist project, cultural project. The establishment of youth projects was a key component of this. If we are to characterize Russia within the themes that we've been exploring, I'm thinking here about neoliberalism, its impacts, austerity, precarity, all of these themes, then Russia, if we can see Latin America as a site of forceful articulation of a neo-socialism and a left turn, then Russia under Putin has ostensibly embraced an sort of alter stance to neoliberalism. Also, Putin crafted himself as an anti-neoliberal crusader who came to power with the goal, ostensibly, of turning against this neoliberal tide of reform, against those who permitted the capitalist oligarchic excesses of the 1990s. Despite all of this populist message, the Putin administration has actually continued many of these policies. All right. I wish I had my slides, but alas. So my contribution then, I'm positioning myself as someone who is examining the innovations in dominance that occur in conjunction with innovations in resistance. And in saying that, I'm quoting Margaret Cirillo from her comments last time at the 2012 conference that I participated in. And so there's a necessity to see these two phenomena as inseparable and unfolding simultaneously. Now, my motivation in undertaking this is in exploring these perversory configurations of power is perhaps a little distinctive, and I want to make that clear. I'm an anthropologist, and as an anthropologist of Russia, my orientation has always been to seek to trouble the forms of representation that predominate in discussion of the area. The Cold War binaries and dualisms that persist, stemming from the political ontology that Mikhail's referred to earlier. Russia is, as I'm sure you're all aware, subject of a very self-complacent set of representations that anthropologist Alexei Yurchak calls binary socialism. Discussions of contemporary Russia and the Putin administration rest on a problematic binary between liberal democracy and authoritarianism. This dualism is asserted in most representations. So in talking about this pro-state, this state-emanating project, I don't wish to merely view it in terms of co-optation of energies. So in this talk, I am trying to put three things into view simultaneously. Three elements. One, international democracy promotion, the project that emanated from this country and from Western European states during the 90s. that project which brought into effect civil society organizations and NGOs, of which many of us are scholars. Secondly, protest movements, such as the uprisings, and including Occupy, and these pro-state youth organizations in Russia. I'm arguing here, I make this move to say that keeping them within the same lens is analytically productive and useful. Okay. If I had images, I would be showing you some very striking images of what these pro-state, pro-Kremlin organizations looked like. The case I'm speaking from is an organization called Nashi, which translates as ours, which was established in 2005 in Russia. Nashi claims to be an independent youth democratic anti-fascist movement. It burst onto the Russian political scene in the spring of 2005, and its characteristic is to mobilize mass numbers of youth. So its inaugural campaign brought 60,000 youth to the streets of Moscow, shut down the streets, occupied public places, but was guarded and supported by state agents, by the police, and its demonstrations have always been in support of the Kremlin and always had this patriotic orientation. Okay, the image would portray that. So a central theme of, and this is a book project that's just been completed that I'm speaking from, so a central theme of the book I've written is in tracing the paradoxical kinship between Putin-era state-run projects and the 90s-era interventions that preceded them. Russia's political technologists are globally aware, borrowing both from the neoliberal toolkit of international democracy promotion and the diverse repertoires of protest that it stimulated. I join those who have been attentive to the circulations of technologies and forms in the aftermath of 90s-era democracy promotion. There's been, as Jessica Greenberg, an anthropologist who studied pro-democracy movements in Serbia, youth-run pro-democracy organizations that overturned the Milosevic regime, as she's argued, there's been a very productive relationship between local activists, policymakers, and international NGOs. And her work traces how former youth activists from Otpor, the Serbian pro-democracy organization, became global resistance consultants, circulating and touting their wares to global movements, including in the Middle East, as well as the color revolutions and post-socialist space. She shows how these technologies and forms of direct action and of street mobilization were institutionalized, for example, in a video game called A Force More Powerful, used to train activists in non-violent forms of revolution. So there's a sort of circulating global pedagogy of non-violent revolution and democratization. And my research is, my work explores how Russian state actors have been paying attention as well. My case shows that the same techniques and strategies which entered the repertoire of celebrated democratic oppositional waves, from the color revolutions to the Arab Spring, can be equally effectively deployed or rebranded for pro-regime purposes. And in tracking them from their inception in 2004 to the Putin-Medvedev era, I'm interested in the play of logics and technologies that takes place within these. Now, Nashi, the organization I've mentioned, was the case study that I wanted to speak from, and I realize I don't have much time to go into this, and I regret that I don't have an image again. But Nashi, right from the get-go, it had two proximate causes. It's been represented, it's discussed and portrayed in the media and by most scholarly accounts that I've come across as the exemplar of authoritarianism, of the descent into authoritarianism. Now, I've examined it in a rather different way by tracing its sort of lineage and this kinship with these other forms and repertoires. I see it as a response. It was clearly established in 2005 as a response to the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, but also in response to the wide forms of social protest that broke out in Russia in 2005 in response to monetizing social welfare reform. So there was this kind of groundswell of energy that was taking place at this time, and this is the moment when this was crafted. Nashi then was an explicit retort to this. It posited and pitched itself as a counterinsurgency operation to prevent similar forms of occupation taking place. Born of this particular historical juncture, it was a complex political technology that talked back to international democracy promotion, drawing on its resources and critiquing them, undertaking complex fusions as it did so. Nashi was designed to deal with the problem of apolitical youth, those who are sick of politics as usual, another link there with those who are disenchanted with representative politics globally, to occupy these youth's energies and loyalties and to enlist them into a specific project of prevention, borrowing both from Democracy Promotion Toolkit and from anarcho-punk DIY culture. Nashi offered up distinctive technologies, particularly to control or occupy the street, to prevent other forms of occupation. So as these Kremlin political technologists crafted these forms, they were borrowing then on the toolkit of those who they had disparaged, including civil society. And here we see a redrawing of these key terms. So civil society, protest, the street itself, and revolution. Revolution during the early 2000s had been, again, I'm interested in the instabilities of these forms. Civil society aid from this country in the 2000s was retooled as a kind of soft power tool to achieve regime change in the region. So we have civil society becomes the means by which revolution, here signaling something desirable, civilizing, and liberal, civil society aid was devoted to support these kinds of projects. Here, US aid flowed to students and oppositional groups in Serbia, Belarus, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, and later Ukraine, encouraging these color revolutions. And here, revolution was something the US wanted to bring on. So these technologists invoke civil society and revolution in a very different way and seek to engage youth activists via Nashi in projects to prevent this from taking place. In the early days, Nashi placed great emphasis on undertaking mass events or securing the streets, as one commissar put it to me. Activists received training in technologies of mass action, as well as education in the arts of political PR or communication. One commissar told me that political communication was a new subfield or an area of study that drew on psychology, public relations, and political science. Reflecting on the early phase of Nashi's work, he explained that the priority was to work with the masses on the streets. I thought at first that he was referring to the social discontents that brought people onto the streets, the masses. For example, the roiling forms of political contestation that were taking place. By 2009, the street, or particularly the Arab street, was a phrase being used widely as to denote a place of sometimes disturbing agency. No, he corrected me. I meant something different. I meant control of street technology, campaigns on the streets, a street format. Now I'm short of time. This was my, so I'll kind of cut to the chase. So I'm offering Nashi as a case study of how these fusions take place and the forms of borrowing that take place as an example of this circulation and of the curious kinship between them. My purpose, my impulse, as I've explained, is to question these binary formulations that assume we know what's going on here. My conclusions, and again, I've been really shaped in my study of this Putin-era phenomenon, of these pro-state movements. I've drawn a lot from the anthropology of direct democracy and the anthropology of resistance. One key insight from the anthropology of resistance is to emphasize the necessity of thick description, of providing nuanced accounts of identification on the part of activists and social movement actors. I argue that thick description this form of thick description, this insight, is equally applicable to those who participate in pro-state movements, ostensibly conformist youth. What I've found through the research I've conducted, and I'm presenting here the results of a collaborative project that engaged youth, many of whom had actually participated in these movements as co-researchers. One of the findings was the instability. Some of the energy described earlier, for example, by Marina Citrin, this kind of goal of taking matters into our own hands, this was manifest, surprisingly, in these pro-state organizations. The stateness was not determining. Youth passed through these movements in remarkably, in diverse and interesting ways. And that's one of the things I explore in 1 minute. Youth were captivated and propelled by many of the same concerns that propel those who participated in anti-globalization and non-state, anti-state movements. Is this resistance too? It's a question that I want at least to entertain. So what this amounts to, paradoxically, is that we shouldn't. I managed to locate sources of instability, possibility within this state-sponsored campaign, and my contention is that we shouldn't preclude ourselves from seeing this. Seeing and recognizing this unpredictability, instability of form. Which direction this takes, of course, is highly uncertain, and to be making this presentation now in the context of the Ukraine-Russia crisis is clearly a sensitive and tricky move. The research I completed in 2011 prior to the protests that broke out. But there are indeterminacies in this whole terrain. Protests did break out subsequent to the formation of this state-run youth project, and since then things have taken a more repressive turn. But I continue to be committed to entertaining this instability, uncertainty, and to working in that space. Thank you.
Next we'll have Barbara Cruikshank from UMass, who'll speak about the time of protest, unsilencing protest in social theory.
Hi, I'm not going to try this, but I really want to make a particular reference to one image that I think most of you will be familiar with from Ferguson, of a young woman holding up a sign that says, "I can't believe I still have to come out on the street and protest against this shit." Remember that? Is that familiar?
Protest against this shit.
What's that? Fucking protest against this shit, yeah. So that's the image that I hope you will bear in mind, and I hope I will not run out of time and be able to return to at the end of this talk. So this paper grew out of a year-long seminar with the Trier Moments Research Group, during which, over and over and over again, we found ourselves reading social theory like contentious politics and other stuff that people have been already talking about today, and saying, oh, there it is again, the repressive hypothesis. It structures social theory in such a way, I want to argue today, that it actually silences and trivializes protest. So I'll try to make that argument clear. But this is particularly troubling and problematic because the kinds of protests undertaken and then explained by this social theory are often conducted in explicit rejection of the repressive hypothesis. And I'm thinking of anarchist, horizontal, and queer protests in particular, that, you know, they've got their Foucault in their back pocket. They've already rejected the repressive hypothesis, and yet social theory continues to mobilize the repressive hypothesis in order to explain things. So in brief, the repressive hypothesis suggests that power represses protest So protest is not itself treated as an expression or an exercise or a practice of power itself. And this strikes me as deeply problematic, and I heard it, and I was glad to hear Stellan invite us to contest his definition of resistance, because I'm about to. I hear the repressive hypothesis in that definition of the subaltern actor that might undermine power. I want to suggest that we think of the subaltern actor that might exercise power as opposed to undermine it. Power is not out there, but power is in the moment and at the time being exercised in the action of protest. And this is something that's made almost impossible to render or to see or articulate in most social theory, present company accepted, of course. And truly. So thus social theory silences and trivializes protest. This is true, of course, in spite of the fact that most social theory is written on the side of protest and written in order to make protest more effective or more successful. So I'm not calling out the motives or the ideology lurking in the depths of social theory. What I'm calling out is the epistemology that guides social theory. I myself am guided by the historian Michel Rolph-Trouillot, who, in demonstrating silence on the subject of the Haitian Revolution in history, taught us to go into the gap between what happened and what is said to have happened. And here's what he has to say. The ways in which what happened and what is said to have happened are and are not the same may itself be historical. Words are not concepts, and concepts are not words. Between the two are layers of theory accumulated throughout the ages. So it's through those layers of theory that I'm heading into to explain how social theory silences protests. So first I want to briefly talk a little bit about the concept and the etymology of protests. So like many concepts that we're familiar with and taking on today, it's only about 100 years old. Like sexuality, for example, or homosexuality, or heterosexuality. It's only about 100 years old. It first became used as with a direct object in the form of protest march at the time of Gandhi's civil rights marches in South Africa, and roughly about 1913. But the word didn't come into everyday usage in English until the 1950s and 60s in reference to the civil rights protests that were underway today. So that usage then is not very old, and yet it propels research on protest as a kind of natural, transhistorical, or universal proper object of inquiry. And this is something I feel like we should be keenly attentive to. So there's a great deal of variance, disagreement, and ambiguity in the usage of the word protest. And yet there is incredibly wide consensus that the occupation of Tahrir Square, a prison hunger strike, the Watts riots, a KKK march, or a hacktivist raid is a protest. So just about anything from, spitting in the master's soup to, sending out a computer virus into the world. All of that can count as protest. So something else actually has to limit the use of protest other than what actually happens in protest. So what happens is, again, covered over, and I think, and here I agree with Stellan, that what we need to do is to look more closely at what is actually done in the context of protests. And I use the example of Mohamed Bouazizi lighting himself on fire in Tunisia as a case in point. So I found all these sources, and I can't go into them all, and they're in the paper, but starting with the From Forum, suggests that Bouazizi's action was an entrepreneurial or economic action, that it was undertaken to protest the impossibility of making a living as a street vendor. Others explained his action in reference to his own shame or humiliation at being slapped publicly by a female police officer, and that his motives then are psychological, emotive. Others argue that his motives are political, that what he did by lighting himself on fire was stage an act of protest. So what I think limits and stabilizes the concept of protest is not what's actually done, because the word can be applied to anything, but the fact of this disaggregation of social, ethical, economic, moral, and other kinds of arenas determine what it means. So through this disaggregation, sorry, I should stick closer to my, so the form that his action took does not matter to the interpretation or the appropriation of Bouazizi's protest. Now, each one of these interpretations is, of course, using Bouazizi to grind their own act or taking him up as a martyr for their own cause. This shouldn't surprise us. This is what people do. This is quite ordinary. What should surprise us is that what he did is overshadowed or silenced by what it is said to mean in one sector of society or another. So the idea that moral outrage, political ideals, economic interests, or personal passions, individual personality or psychology, and ethical dispositions are harnessed in protest is quite commonplace. But we speak as if each source of outrage, moral, political, personal, economic, and so on, or ideological, is distinctive. Each its own causal force propelling people onto the streets to take action. These demarcations, social, economic, private, political, are themselves upheld by the concept of protest and by its ubiquitous use to apply to everything. So the form that Bouazizi's action took, what he actually did and what actually happened, does not matter to the explanation given for his action. What he did is overshadowed by what it is said to mean. Whatever happened when the man lit himself on fire, it is what came before in the form of a motive or a cause, or what came after the revolution or the reproduction of the status quo that determined the significance, the meaning, and the importance of his actions. So this is why my title is The Time of Protest. Thus, by the time of protest, I mean the time of protest itself. During the time of what happens and the action of protest are silenced by what is said to have happened. So social theory plays a role in silencing protest. Protest is temporalized in ways that stabilize the force of protest by relegating it to the time of the event. So weather and disease metaphors are ubiquitous in social science literatures and in security discourses and in popular media that characterize the emergence of recent transnational protests. For example, a crashing wave of protest, another surge or swell or turn in the cycle of protest or the cycle of contagion. And these metaphors encourage us to think of protests as singular events, arising under certain circumstances and according to patterns of uncontrollable forces or coming out of the blue. Weather events, like protest events, stand apart from the fair weather we have every day and are discontinuous, episodic, and they are weather that breaks out, like a breaking story in the news, to punctuate discontinuous time. Protests, like weather, can also mark time, e.g. the Arab winter or the Arab spring, and make history. So forecasting, then, is the principal mode of narrating both the weather and protest. Searching in the past for clues for what is coming, and weather metaphors tend to stabilize or eventalize singularities and singular events in the narratives of protest and in the conceptualizations of protest in social theory that account for what happened amidst many and uncontrollable forces. So social theory, of course, aims to explain what is central and what is trivial about protest, to explain the forces, which forces move and shape events, and which merely accompany them. So even the stories we tell about the history of social science research, like my own story, temporalizes protest in ways that probably silence what happened. So social science research on protest, and the lion's share of it conducted in the discipline of sociology is obviously abundant. Most of the reviews of that literature track the developments, sometimes even the progress, of social science research on protest and social movements alongside the emergence of its various schools. Thus, we're told that progress in social science research on protest leaps from one theoretical framework to another, from collective action to political opportunity structures, to resource mobilization, to new social movements, very often actually left out of the story are new social movements, to framing, and to dynamics of contention. Or we're told a different kind of story about these various schools of protest as we might be told the history of protest movements themselves, as sectarian squabbles of competing vanguards. Social theory, in both ways of telling the story, is the driver, and protest is the car. My findings suggest otherwise, that our concept of protest is doing far too much of the driving. Now I'm going to jump to another part of the paper, so there's this awkward thing, so I apologize. One of the things I noticed in recent, especially very recent, social theory on protest, especially protests since 2011, is that they are over and over and over again referred to on both the far left and the far right as not political. So, for example, the magazine The Economist actually has like an intellectual arm. It's a think tank, and it has a scary name, which I can't remember, and I'm not going to try to find right now, but it's a little ominous. Anyway, they published this report, which is written for not only business leaders, but policymakers, primarily in the West. And the question before them is, what do we have to fear from this this global uprising happening out in the world around us? And the answer is, we don't have anything to fear because these movements are not political. Now, the same exact argument is being made on the far left by Alain Badiou, for example, who argues that without the horizon, moving to the horizon of an idea with a capital I, these movements aren't political. Doug Henwood in the United States, a very loud voice in the U.S. Protest movements, argues, and he uses the exact same phrase as this right-wing think tank from The Economist. He said, Wall Street couldn't have hoped for a better opponent or a weaker opponent than what they have found in Occupy. They're making exactly the same kinds of claims about protest, that it's not political and we have nothing to worry about. So to look at protest in this way as not political is to say that protest cannot change what counts as politics. I'm trying to get us to see that protest is a way of exercising power, right? That we shouldn't look to what its motives before or its consequences after, but to what is actually done in the context of protest, like turning the body, for example, into a site of action. If that is exactly what protests are probably doing, which is changing what counts as politics, making things political or resistance that were formerly demarcated as economic, social, cultural, psychological, or ethical. Thus, such accounts of protests as not politics trivialize the trenchant rage expressed at seeing the bailout of banks as a necessary economic measure with no political effects. It leaves in place the categories that evangelize protest and measure its effects by what its own vocabulary renders invisible. I want to say something about the World Cup. Maybe you can imagine what it is I would say about the World Cup. So protesters themselves in a number of places refer to their own actions as not political, meaning I think that they are not electoral or they're not governmental. They're not aiming at the state. So an anarchist might say, for example, my actions aren't political. What I'm doing is creating a whole new way of life. Because they don't want, they give over the ordinary language of what counts as politics or concede to it without trying to tackle it. And I think of prefigurative politics as doing just that. And I know I'm out of time, so thank you very much. Wow.
Thanks, Barbara. We'll now have two discussants. First, Margaret Cerullo from Hampshire College.
Both Jeff and I are going to speed wrap so that you all get a chance to, can you hear? Yeah, if I can find that, that would be great, if I have time. All right, I thought these papers were just sparkling and completely provocative and great to think with. I should say that Sonia said this was about Latin America, this session, about which I know a little bit. I know absolutely nothing about Russia, Egypt. No, the whole conference was going to focus on Latin America, except for this session. And so I would just, as a caveat, I know absolutely nothing about any of the areas of the world that these papers addressed, other than what I read in the papers. So. But it seemed to me that just to recall where we've been in the last hour and a half, each of the papers identifies theoretical orientations, epistemologies, even ontologies, that they argue make illegible or even inconceivable the political significance of contemporary protest. And Barbara and Michal asked us to slow down the march of time so that we can actually look at and possibly see protest itself, to let it speak in its own terms, to displace the conceptual apparatuses and the material apparatuses such as the economics, I believe it's called the Economist Intelligence Unit. That also struck me. Both the conceptual and the institutional apparatuses that assure us that nothing happened. There is nothing to see. What Kristen Ross, in an underappreciated book that I recommend to you on the afterlives of May '68, calls the police function. Move along, there's nothing to see, nothing happens. So, if we do, what are some of those legitimating frameworks that have been identified today that I do think are worth noting, that block us from seeing modernist ontology? Another more legible, familiar, and comforting figure of rebellion, a tech-savvy middle-class youth that covers over and includes a different figure that Paul identified, depoliticizing discourses that criminalize, moralize, or cast as pre-political or perhaps merely cultural. Other forms of protest. Something else that I would just like to, that sort of provoked me a little bit, is a kind of instrumentalizing discourses that identify protest as a tactic, and therefore its significance has to do with its effects. And always when I hear instrumental from my long formation in sociology, I cannot but think expressive, which is, and of course that's a very gendered opposition in sociology. So if protests are not effectively instrumental, that means they're merely expressive, which is feminine rather than masculine, serious, and real. And finally, Barbara's brilliant identification of the repressive hypothesis, which in these terms means that protests like sex erupts only when power weakens and can't hold it down. Protest, as she tells us in her full paper, which is fabulous, and I recommend it to you all, doesn't make history. That is, history makes protest. Protest doesn't make history. That is, what does it mean to make history? Open a field of unexpected and undecided possibilities. And I think that all of these apparatuses are important in making sure that we don't see and that we don't remember, or they are really, it was very, the reason I turned to Kristen Ross, I was teaching a class on Occupy, and I thought it was very important for my students to begin to think about how the memory of Occupy was being constructed even as it was unfolding. And so I think the function of these apparatuses, intellectual and institutional, is to defuse the memory of protests, to absolutely eliminate the glimpse of possible outcomes other than those that actually took place. All right, a number of questions arose for me, for the panelists and from the papers, and also for the audience. One is, how do we recognize a Tahrir moment? And that really came out of Julie's paper, but she in some ways answered it. That is to say, is Nashi, this state organized, a very strange locution, a state-sponsored civil society movement, which seems oxymoronic, but nonetheless, is Nashi, can we understand that as a Tahrir moment when, I mean, and her thick description is something that I also commend to you, where they arrive from the provinces in buses in Moscow, and everybody wants to go because they don't get to go to Moscow very often, and they arrive and the police are everywhere, there's no traffic. The police have blocked off the central square and they open the barricades to allow them through. And when the kids arrive, they're all busy with their cell phones, snapping selfies of one another, and as many as can leave as quickly as possible to go shopping. So I did raise the question, is this a Tahrir moment? And how do we delimit and what's at stake in these various delimitations? I wanted to ask Sakya whether, and now I think how, do virtual bodies act in alliance? And those women's bodies that are certainly on the line, that do seem to be enacting power, making history, and doing something. Then I wanted to ask many of you, all of you, is the Tahrir moment queer? And because queer did surface, particularly in Paul's paper, but also in Barbara's, I believe. And what do we mean by suggesting that it's queer? How are we deploying queer? I thought, Paul, that you did it in two ways. To point to the illegible others that are the constitutive outside of the figures that do appear and occlude them. So that's a sort of more generic notion of queer, but also a reference to the gender embodiments of these two figures of youth that he identified, which you suggest are queer and not the rigid, muscular masculinity embodying of the army or the other groups of thugs. They embody then a queer masculinity, perhaps. But I also wanted to ask you about how unsettled is gender in the youth movements that you so enticingly described. That carnivals that sometimes extend into elementary school occupations, or are we seeing one or possibly two male figures being revealed behind another largely male figure of the dominant narrative of the Arab Spring? And finally, I wondered about your formulation, Michal, of movements versus moments, which I found very provocative. And I wondered if we needed to break that frame for, I think, reasons that you also felt. And I wondered whether some notion of the event might help us to do that, something that kind of arrives in excess, beyond calculation, but isn't a kind of thunderclap, you know, in the otherwise serene sky, but has a preparation. And I wanted, how much time do I have? No.
Less than a minute.
Okay, less than a minute. Well, I wanted to show you, I remain interested in innovations in dominance. If you want to look it up, St. Louis Symphony Protest, I don't know. I thought maybe some of you were traveling and maybe missed the St. Louis Symphony Protest. Have you all seen it? Yeah. Oh, you all have seen it, so then I can just describe it. It's a 2-minute clip. Can we look it up, the St. Louis Symphony Protest? Innovations in dominance. I mean, I just felt we had to register something about Ferguson today since we're here and they're there. And I wonder, you know, how this movement, are we seeing another Tahrir moment? And why has it taken us maybe so long to be able to recognize it? Because what's happening in Ferguson didn't either, you know, kind of come out of nowhere. And I just found the St. Louis Symphony Protest really an event as part of an event. And thinking about what Bonnie Honig said yesterday about retooling or refunctioning older kind of radical traditions. You will hear that in this protest. You'll also see a very innovative use of media. How are we doing? Innovative use of media, which focuses on the spectators, who are in many ways in the position of the rest of America. I mean, they're stand-ins for all of us. And I think we've got it. Thank you. It's very short, I promise.
For my crown, justice for us all. Justice for my crown, justice for us all. Which side are you on, friend? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, friend? Which side are you on? Justice for my crown, justice for us all. Justice for my crown, justice for us all. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Converged in Times Square in front of the police station. If you haven't seen that, you might want to Google that. But an event in the sense that it presents a new situation for thought. I think that's partly what we're trying to understand about career. Thank you.
I forgot what I was going to say. Reminds me the 19th century opera houses in Europe used to be sites for protest, right? The Liceo in Barcelona. Anyhow.
You want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm Jeff from Northeastern. And I have 5 minutes. I was so excited by these papers that I wrote 7 pages of notes, which is about an hour talk, which I'm now going to start giving, thanks to these papers. But let's see if I can summarize this in 5 minutes. So we're talking a lot about sort of diffusing and challenging binaries, and so I think I'm going to move along in that spirit, but I'm going to maybe even challenge the binary of modernism, non-modernism itself, which is perhaps oxymoronic. But so the idea that protest is either instrumental or expressive, it's institutional or everyday and cultural, it's modernist, anti-modernist. I think protest is everything and all of these things, and I think we can read it along one register, the register of temporality, which is what really came out for me in this paper and this research group. So I think what I really want to do is talk about the different modes of temporality that emerge in the papers. And let me cut to the chase because I'm going to run out of time. But I think that these diverse temporalities are all at work within the movements that we're talking about. I think reality is constituted by these diverse temporalities. I think modernity itself is constituted by diverse temporalities and ontologies and spatialities. We have to speak about time and space together, not to get too abstract. And I think Michal's sort of telling of her own ambiguousness about wanting to promote these alternative practices of emergence, of becoming, of consensus, but also voting, is a nice indication of how as individuals we often move back and forth between these diverse modes of temporality. Moreover, there's actually struggles and tensions around these kinds of temporalities within movements themselves. We often talk about a spatial politics. We might talk about a temporal politics between movements and our adversaries and within movements themselves. So that's basically the argument. But just real quick, the diverse kinds of temporalities that I saw in the papers. There's generational time, which was really important. In Paul's paper, in terms of not just youth, but children. I think that's really interesting. And children also as a category that can destabilize binaries, particularly laboring children, street children, right? It diffuses all sorts of other binaries I don't have time to go into. In Sapia's paper, the sort of older, more formal women's movements versus the younger movements that are expressive and demonstrating the body and sexuality. certainly in Julie's paper about youth movements in Russia. But these papers also destabilize the idea that youth is progressive, right? We have state-oriented movements, we have children's movements in support of dictatorships. Also, interestingly, we also often think about sort of non-modernist practices and movements, consensus, prefiguration, as belonging to youth movements and adult movements or institutional, right? We might challenge that as well. There's also what we might call protest time or liminality. I write lots about this in terms of ritual. Paul didn't have time to talk too much about the fascinating parts of his paper that dealt with this, but sort of rituals, liminal rituals among children in Egypt, and how those give rise to certain kinds of street protests. But this sort of begs the question about sort of the Carnival problem, or Max Gluckman's rituals of rebellion. Are these periodic moments that give rise to renewed outbursts of order and repression, as sometimes it seems that they are? Or to what extent do they generate other kinds of more lasting or viral kinds of transformations? How do we think through that? There's calendrical time or cyclical time that comes through all of these papers, right? The whole idea of waves and cycles of protest, right? Or Malucci's sort of going back and forth between visibility and latency. What does that temporal framework mean when we think about movements in that way? What does it enable? What does it foreclose? There's historical time, what we might call dominant historical time, that Barbara's paper was really taking issue with. This is the time of states and institutions. What does it mean to read movements only through that time? What's silenced? And sort of the questions, when do emergence emerge, recede, or fail? What's being left out when we think about movements in terms of dominant historical time? But how can we not think about movements within those times as well? If we're really, if we're interested in the impact on people in their everyday lives, these sorts of temporalities matter as well. Then there's what we might call movement time or revolutionary time. This is also in Barbara's paper. I think she may have left out part of that in the middle when she was talking. But the idea that movements also produce their own time, their own history. So, I mean, clearly, sort of revolutions, the first thing that often happens is you recreate a new calendar, right? The French Republican calendar, La Hora Zapatista, rejecting, right, daylight savings time. We might think about time in a similar way as you think about space, right? Lefebvre's famous formulation that a revolution has to produce a new space. Perhaps a revolution has to produce a new time. And I'll quote Lefebvre, but substitute time for space. Any revolution that does not produce a new time has not realized its full potential. Indeed, it has failed in that it has not changed life itself, but has merely changed ideological superstructures, institutions, or political apparatuses. Of course, Alain Touraine famously talked about movements as struggles for the control of historicity, or the models by which we understand social change. So theorists have also been thinking about things in this way for a while as well. Then there are the alternative temporalities that Michal was talking about, and to some extent Barbara, non-modernist temporalities that are also new forms of spatiality, ontology, new ways of being and knowing that are non-linear, that are about becoming, that are about emergent properties, and the ways in which these kinds of temporalities are often incommunicable with respect to dominant temporalities. And what might it mean to sort of see them as not counterposed, but simply existing on different planes. And therefore the task becomes creating lines of translation between different kinds of temporalities and getting beyond lots of stale debates that we spend hours talking about, not least of which reform versus revolution, which plays out in this sort of temporal kind of mode. And finally, just one that didn't come out in the paper so much, but I've been thinking about a lot, apocalyptic temporalities. I was at the Climate Justice March. My friend Eddie Ewan and a couple of collaborators, I think Doug Henwood actually was part of that. That's a different story, we can talk later. We're talking about sort of the impact of apocalyptic time and thinking about climate justice. What does that generate? What does it foreclose? Does that mean we need revolution now, or does that mean we can't wait for the revolution? But anyway, so there are these different temporalities. They have different kinds of significance. I think we need to see movements as constituted by these diverse temporalities. And I think we need to pay ethnographic attention to how they emerge, what they are, what they mean, what the impacts are, and the ongoing everyday micro-political struggles between different kinds of temporalities. And strategically, I think we need to think about how to see these temporalities as not opposed, but how to think about moving forward on multiple planes simultaneously. So I'll stop there.